Let's open our Bibles tonight to Esther chapter 9. And we're going to begin with verse 12, but I'm not going to read all of the verses. We will be using most of them, but we won't read all of them. In chapter 9, we saw that the Jews were supposed to be slaughtered on the 13th day of the 12th month. On our calendar, that would be December. The Jews' calendar is not like our calendar, but would have still been the 12th month, the 13th day. The Jews were all going to be slaughtered. Well, we saw that Esther and Mordecai, or Esther, had succeeded with God's help of getting rid of wicked Haman, and then the king put Mordecai in Haman's place. Haman and Esther and all the wise men could not change the first decree, so they said, okay, we can't change the first decree, so we will give the Jews permission to gather together and to fight together against those that would have been their enemy. And so the 13th day came around, and they had a massacre. And we'll look at the numbers here in just a couple of minutes. But what happened next? After the massacre, what happened to Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews? Now, Esther makes an unusual request. In verse 12, the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace. It would be like a super large, extra large White House. This is where the king lived. This is where all of his servants lived. This is where there perhaps were hundreds of people. Well, we know there were at least 500 there that were enemies of the Jew. So this is where the king said, you destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's province? Before Esther gives the answer, she says, there is one more request that I would like to ask in verse 13. If it please the king, in the palace, let us do tomorrow the same thing we did today. Why did she want a second day to murder or to kill? It wasn't murder, it was self-defense. Why did she want a second day to kill the enemies in the palace? How many of you can take a wild guess and think you have it? Nobody. Ouch. Okay. Where did Mordecai and Esther live? They lived in the palace. We all agree with that, right? They lived in the palace. That is where they would be most at risk. If you can imagine the White House on a much bigger scale, and inside of the White House, you've got people that are seeking any and every opportunity to get up to the president's chambers, private chambers, and kill the president. You would want to take every precaution. They had already killed 500 in the palace that were wanting to kill Mordecai and Esther. She said there's still a lot more that we didn't have time to take care of. So for safety's sake. You don't want enemies living in your quarters that can come up and kill you anytime, day or night. So she said, because we live here, because we are most at risk here, the danger is greater here. Can we do the same thing tomorrow to make sure there's no enemies of me and Mordecai in the palace? It may seem strange to some of us, but there were still people who were loyal to Haman, even though he had been hung and his 10 sons had been hung. There were still people that were loyal to Haman. They were still the enemy of the Jews. Now, there may have been some anti-Semitism there, but there was certainly loyalty to Haman, even though he was despicable, he was evil, he was wicked, he was arrogant, he was egotistical, he was narcissistic. There were still people that were loyal to him. And Esther said, I don't want to live in the palace with people that are still loyal to Haman. And so the king granted a second day. On the second day, they killed another 300 people that were planning to kill the Jews on the 13th. Throughout the rest of the province, they killed 75,000 people throughout the 127 provinces that were willing and wanting to destroy the Jews. Only they ended up being the ones that killed. You know, we've often heard and read in the Bible, the Jews have always been hated. You go back and read history, they have been massacred by countless kings and rulers. There are even today, and I won't name countries, but you can look it up very easily. There are nations today that would wipe Israel off the map if they got the opportunity. In fact, I read recently, if you can believe anything on the internet, that there are nations even today that are plotting and planning how they can march down and literally blow Israel off of the map. We've seen a little of it with Iran. We've seen it with other nations. So it's nothing new that there have always been people that wanted to annihilate Israel. But they were not successful. 75,000 killed in the kingdom, 800 killed in the palace. Haman killed, his 10 sons killed. And it's time to celebrate. Now, I looked up Purim on the internet this afternoon. Learned a lot of interesting things about it, and we'll share some of those later, but they basically, most of them fought on the 13th day and celebrated on the 14th. In Shushan, they fought on the 13th and the 14th, and they celebrated on the 15th, they celebrated. It was an all-day celebration. Now, I learned something this afternoon that I did not know. Nowadays, in our modern time, the 21st century, 22nd century, whatever it is, their celebration now starts on the 13th, goes the 14th, and goes through the 15th and ends at evening on the 15th. They took the 13th, 14th, and 15th as a time of celebration. It was an all day. In fact, now it is several days celebrating God's deliverance from their enemies. It's called Purim. And I had heard what that meant and what it stood for. But several websites all said the same thing, which make me believe that it probably is true. The word Purim simply means to cast lots. That's what Haman did to come up with those dates. He cast lots, came up with the 12th month and the 13th day. Today it is celebrated over several days, and no other holiday can be celebrated during those days. Hanukkah, Passover, doesn't matter, no other holiday can fall on the days of Purim. Mordecai and Esther both wrote commands that this holiday is to be celebrated every year. And it's still going on even today, which this was written roughly in 509 BC. So we're at 21 plus 5, 2,600 years ago, and it's still being celebrated today. That's how much the Jews wanted to celebrate God's deliverance. It's said that, and again, several sites, it is the happiest holiday on the Jewish calendar. Now, we're familiar with the Passover. That's a very solemn, serious time. Some people are familiar with Yom Kippur. Some are familiar with Hanukkah and different ones. Those are very serious times. The holidays of Purim are pure celebration. In fact, I read several descriptions. One of them said that during this time, they get so drunk in celebrating that they can't remember if Haman was the good guy or the bad guy, or if Mordecai was the good guy or the bad guy. They celebrate by giving gifts one to another, giving food and different things to people in need. They give gifts, they party, they feast, they eat, they celebrate. It is a several day time of giving gifts, giving to the poor, and eating. Why is that important? That'll be my very last point, which I'm on. I told you I'd keep it short tonight. At least I'll try. What about us celebrating God's deliverance? Now, do not raise your hand. I do not want to see hands. I don't even need nods or anything, but can you remember the day God saved you? I know some of us can. God had delivered the Jews from their enemy and certain death. God saved their life and gave them freedom. Do we celebrate Purim today? I found a couple of websites that said in 2026, here are the dates that they will celebrate the Feast of Purim. And I didn't write them down because we don't celebrate Purim. We were not threatened with death from our enemy. We did not have to fight to get our freedom. But do we celebrate special occasions in our Christian walk? Again, do not raise your hand. How many of us celebrate birthdays? I will turn a milestone this year. My wife knows that there are certain milestones that are special celebration days. 50 years, that was a time to celebrate. 70 years, 80 years. You know, some of you may not know this because you got a long way to go. But when a member of the church turns 80, we have a special celebration for them. That's a big milestone. 80 years old. I think we should back it up because not very many people live to be 80. In fact, when I get the obits on my phone, 40, 50, 60, 70, they're dropping like flies. But we have certain milestones. In children, we celebrate their birth. You'll get to see in a few more months. We celebrate the birth of a child. Normally, they have a baby shower. They give gifts. They have diapers. They have, all kinds of things. It's a time of celebrating the birth of a child. And then, I don't know about you all, but, the first 10 or 15 birthdays, we celebrate. When they turn 16 and get their license, we stop celebrating. Now we start praying for their safety, but we celebrate birthdays, anniversaries. Husbands, don't ever forget your wife's anniversary. Well, that's my anniversary too. You're not important, guys. I don't want to pop your bubble. You're not important, but you better not forget your wife's anniversary. She put up with you for all these years. My wife has put up with me for almost 55 years. She deserves a medal. She deserves a crown. We celebrate anniversaries. We celebrate all kinds of things. We celebrate high school graduation. We celebrate college graduation. And when our children, we were in Texas, they celebrated kindergarten graduation. They had a full service, everything. Kids walked up, got a diploma for graduating kindergarten of all things. We celebrate all kinds of things. Birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, the birth of a child. Have you ever thought about if my physical birthday is important? I tell people, and this is the honest truth, I could not make this up, I was born on Thanksgiving morning because my parents were too poor to buy a turkey, so they had me instead. I was born on Thanksgiving. Everybody was happy except my mom. She wanted a girl, and when they told her I was a boy, she almost broke down and cried. But everybody else celebrated. Everybody else was happy. We celebrate. Somebody graduates from, now they've got it junior high. You celebrate kindergarten, you celebrate junior high, you celebrate high school, then you celebrate college, then you celebrate their wedding, then you celebrate the birth of their first child, you celebrate when they buy a house, you celebrate. We have dozens of celebrations. Did you ever think about if my physical birthday was worth celebrating, how much more the day God saved me? Which is more important, being physically born or being spiritually born again? Don't raise your hand, but how many, I asked you this a while ago, how many of you even remember the day God saved you? Now, I know, I remember the day God saved me, but I did not know what day it was. When my mom died, my brother and I were going through, looking at, all of her stuff. Do you want this? Do you want that? Would you like to have this? And in going through some stuff, we found Mom's old original Bible. And as we were looking through, she had, on the first few pages, she had the date that God saved me, the day and the year. She had the day and the year that God saved my brother. The only reason I know it was August the 10th is because that was in Mom's Bible when she died. You know how I know I was born on November 22nd? Because it's on my birth certificate. I would never have known had they not told me. So not everybody remembers the exact date and the month and the year that God saved them. But you remember, if you're saved, you remember. I can remember when God saved me. I may not know the day, I may not know the year, but I remember that Sunday morning when God saved me. It is just as clear in my mind as anything that's ever happened to me. So why don't we take some time and celebrate when God saved us? Around Thanksgiving, we used to, we would meet in someone's home and we would go around the room, name 3 things you're thankful to God for. And it was almost always, I'm thankful for my wife. I'm thankful for, whatever. But when was the last time we celebrated God's deliverance from sin? To me, that's far more important than celebrating the fact that I was born on November the 22nd. My salvation means far more than the day that I was born. Mom even had the date that we were baptized in there. By the way, we did not have baptistries back then. We went down to a real large creek, and I was baptized in a creek. In college, we had to learn to baptize in a creek because baptismal still were not real popular even back then. Why is it we celebrate everything except the most important day of our life? Now, if you don't remember the day, the month, and the year, don't feel bad. Most people don't. But set a time and just say, God, I want to spend the day thanking you for saving my soul. I want to celebrate the day that you delivered me from sin and bondage. Not physical bondage, spiritual bondage. When was the last time you celebrated when God saved someone? You know, we come around and give them the right hand of fellowship, which I think is a great idea. But when was the last time you went home and celebrated when God saved someone? The Jews now spend 3 days celebrating God's deliverance from Haman and his evil ways. When was the last time you even thanked God for saving your soul? I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. That's not what I'm trying to do. But you know, we celebrate so many things. And by the way, for anniversaries, 25 is silver, 50 is gold, diamonds are in there somewhere. I don't know. What's 55? I'll have to find out this year. When all the celebrations, the Bengals won, let's celebrate. And we never stop and thank God for the greatest blessing on earth. The Jews gave gifts. They distributed to the poor and needy. Wait a minute. Isn't that what we're supposed to do all year round? If you see your enemy hungry, feed him. If your enemy thirsts, give him to drink. Oh, that's what we're supposed to do every day, isn't it? Let's take time to celebrate, really celebrate God